Oops. Put a filter on by mistake. How do I switch this off? Switched it off. Hi, everyone. It's 7 p.m., which means we're going to be chatting all things gender-based violence. It's part of a Her Way Out Instagram series that we started last month. And today we're going to continue that. It's episode 2. So I'm just going to invite Lindsay from Lawyers Against Abuse, and we'll get started. Hey, Lindsay.
Hi, Bryoni. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well.
So welcome to our Instagram live series. I'm very happy to have you here so we can chat about gender-based violence. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about Lindsay and about your organization?
Sure. So thanks so much for having me on the series. My name is Lindsay Henson. As you said, I'm the executive director for a nonprofit organization called Lawyers Against Abuse, or we go by LVA for short. I myself am an attorney, a member of the New York State Bar. So my background is in law, but yeah, that's not necessarily what I do with LVA on a daily basis. But I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to chat about gender-based violence. I hope we have, just an engaging and informative session for everyone who's joining us tonight.
Cool, thanks, Lindsay. So let's kick in. What does it actually mean to be a victim of GBV?
Yeah, so I mean, GBV, we know stands for gender-based violence, and it's definitely a term that gets thrown around quite a bit in South Africa, just unfortunately given the high prevalence rates that we experience in this country. And we see it in the headlines often. I think it helps to just really start off by understanding really what is gender-based violence. Sometimes you'll hear violence against women, and sometimes people will use those terms interchangeably. But really, when we talk about gender-based violence, we mean that any form of violence that's perpetrated against you because of your gender or because of a vulnerability that's associated with your gender. And so we can get into it, but some common types of gender-based violence would be things like physical abuse or sexual abuse. Those would be forms of gender-based violence. And the distinction between, gender-based violence versus violence against women is that, both men and women can experience different forms of gender-based violence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it is it's really not a nice one. And you mentioned 2 forms of gender-based violence. Are there any other forms?
Lost you. Okay, great. Sorry, I lost you for a sec. Yeah, so I mean, I think most often people will think about like physical forms of violence. So either like physical abuse or sexual abuse. But there are actually many non-physical forms of abuse that are also fall within the broad definition of either gender-based violence or a subset, which would be domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
So this would include things like verbal abuse, economic abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse. So those would all be considered forms of gender-based violence.
Mm-hmm. And from your experience, what do these forms of, like, what impact does gender-based violence have on not only individuals, but also communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. If we look at the impact, and of course it's going to vary by individual as well as vary by the type of violence it is. But if we think about just kind of broad terms, I think the first thing I would think about is just the negative mental health impacts that experiencing any form of pressure
Connection is a bit bad.
and negative consequences would be things like, experiencing a high degree of fear following an incident of gender-based violence, feelings of helplessness, Oftentimes we see, so I didn't mention, so Lawyers Against Abuse, we work specifically to address gender-based violence, and some of that work is then providing direct services to victims of violence themselves. And so over the years, we've supported thousands of victims, both psychosocial support as well as legal support, but we'll get into that later. But for us, I'm going to refer to our clients. That's what I mean when I'm talking about our clients. But one of the common things that we see with our clients is that we're looking, high levels of feelings of shame or guilt, where people feel like, that they're somehow like tarnished now because of what's happened to them, or maybe they even feel like somehow it's their fault, they're partially to blame, they've somehow contributed to it. So I think that those are just some of the impacts of experiencing GBV. And of course, then you'll have other physical symptoms like sleeplessness, inability to eat, kind of listlessness, or on the other side, you could have kind of hyperarousal where you're in this constant state of anxiety or fear, right? So it can really, it can go kind of either way. And then if you think about impacts on communities, you would think about, obviously communities are made up of individuals. And so you would think about how all of these impacts that an individual experience then aggregate at a community level and even a societal level, where it's then going to have impacts on someone's ability to even care for their children, or impacts on their ability to maintain their job. They may lose their job because of some of these impacts of the GBV that they've experienced. So I think that has massive implications. And there's even been studies, if you look at kind of cumulatively what the cost of gender-based violence, or I think it looked at specifically at intimate partner violence, what the cost of it is on kind of the economy, and looking at the GDP when you're looking at it at a national level as well. So, I mean, it's yeah.
It's massive. It's massive. So I think GBV is something that affects more of us. And how can we support a victim that is possibly a friend or a family? What can we, with our two hands, physically and what can we do?
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's the reality. Just given, if you look at the statistics and look at the levels, the prevalence levels in this country, like you've either experienced it or of someone or several people who have.
Yes.
So I think it's a really important question so that we can feel more empowered to be a source of support for others, right? So I would say the first thing is just actually believe them. So if someone has trusted you enough to disclose their experience of either historic abuse or violence, or perhaps they're even currently in an abusive relationship, I think the first thing is just to believe them, full stop, and to not question them, and to remind them or tell them that what's happened to them or is happening to them isn't their fault and they're not to blame. So I think that that's the first thing. The other, one of the other things I would say is just to validate their emotions, their feelings, acknowledge that it was hard for them. It must have been hard for them to share that with you, and to just acknowledge their bravery for even speaking out. Other things I would say would be, just to encourage them to actually, if that's something that they want to do, to get help. And I mean, I can provide some resources but there's loads of nonprofit organizations that provide free services throughout the country. And so to try and speak to a professional, whether that's if you want to get legal assistance, or if you want to get, speak to a social worker or a therapist or a counselor about what you are experiencing. But I think the one thing, like one caveat to that would be, don't take away their agency, because such a big thing in instances of GBV is just this loss of control and this loss of, or this violation of your personal autonomy. And so I think that even though someone may be well-meaning by trying to get somebody help, they can also contribute to that feeling of disempowerment by kind of removing somebody's agency and kind of acting for them or on their behalf. So I think that's one of the things to always keep in the back of your mind, which is, asking them, letting them kind of guide the process, and to say, well, how, you tell me, how best can I support you? And then the last thing I would say is just don't get discouraged. It's so important just to be patient with somebody and to not give up. Because I think, as we'll speak about a bit later, it can take a long time for somebody to leave an abusive relationship. And I think if you're trying to help them, you get frustrated and then you might want to write them off. But, that's the opposite of what you should be doing. So those
Mm,
would be just some of the just practical ways that we can show up for people.
yeah. And would you say that that is sort of the similar thing if we are ourselves
Mm.
fall victim to GBV?
Yeah, I mean, I think then you would just tell those things to yourself, to remind yourself that it's not your fault, that you're not alone, that there is support out there, if and when you're ready to move forward, and just recognizing. I think just even just being are there to help.
Hey,
Bryoni,
hello.
I think oh, sorry, I think I lost you. I didn't hear you. If you
It
want to
did
repeat a
disconnect
question.
for a little bit. Yeah, no, I
Okay.
just we were answering the question about if we have to fall victim to being gender-based violence, will
Mm.
those be sort of the same steps we can take, or what can we do?
Yeah, so I would just say that, some of those similar things to remind yourself that it's not your fault, that you're not to
Yeah.
blame for what's happened to you, that you're not alone, that there are organizations out there that are ready and willing to offer you support when you're ready to kind of take that step forward.
Mm,
And then just, to be aware of, and we can get into it, like what your available legal rights are, your legal remedies, if that's something that you would also want to pursue. But I
yeah.
think as just a starting point to talk to somebody. I mean, there's a great organization based in Cape Town called the Rape Crisis Trust, and their kind of tagline is, "If you can't talk to anyone, talk to us."
Mhm.
And they run like a toll-free, 24/7 hotline for victims of GBV. So I think that would be, yeah, one resource. But there are others out there as well.
That's amazing. So we often hear, like you mentioned earlier, people take forever to leave their abusers if it has to be domestic violence, or they return back to their abuser in a domestic violence instance. But what are the common myths around GBV?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at intimate partner violence, I think one of the big ones is just that. Like, why doesn't she leave? Why does she stay so long? Or if she does leave, why does she go back? And I think one of the things that can be really helpful to understand in terms of that pattern of behavior is what's referred to as like the cycle of violence. And this isn't something that's specific to South Africa. It's like a well-studied and documented phenomenon that occurs across the world. But really, what the cycle of violence looks like is it's just this repeated pattern of behavior, a cycle, where you would have, an incident of violence, and then after following an incident, then you would have this what's referred to as the honeymoon period. So then the perpetrator would apologize. It will never happen again. I'm so sorry. And then from there, you enter into a period of calm, where maybe then they're fulfilling whatever promises. Maybe they say, let's go to couples counseling, I'll do better. And then it's calm for a while. And then the fourth stage is that tension starts to build again until there's another incident of violence. And what we see and what's well documented is that this cycle then repeats itself. And as it repeats itself, what is evidenced is that those incidents become increasingly severe or more violent over time, as well as that's the length that cycle takes to complete becomes shorter over time. So for example, like maybe in the beginning of a relationship, what starts off as just maybe verbal abuse, and not to belittle verbal abuse, but what is a non-physical form of abuse then escalates to a slap or a push. And then the next time you go through the cycle, it's more violent, right? Until then it can be quite life-threatening. And perhaps initially it takes like a year for the entire cycle to repeat itself, to the other end of the extreme where perhaps the cycle is repeating itself within a day, even a week or a day.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we understand that that's what's going on, then it can help. That's what we call a trauma informed approach. We understand that that's what's going on, and that helps. I think helps us have more empathy
Yeah.
to understand why is it that somebody would kind of either stay or they would leave and go back.
Mm,
Um, but some of the other things, I mean, intimate partner violence in particular is so complex. Some of the other key factors would be things like fear. So, in these relationships, they are about power and control. And so you may have that abusive partner, making threats to say, if you leave me, it's the last thing
yeah.
you'll do. And research shows us that, actually the period of time that a woman is most at risk is immediately after she's left an abusive relationship, because that's kind of this final act of, you don't have control over me. And that's where you sometimes see these kind of murder suicide situations. Some of the other contributing factors are things like, abuse has been so normalized. So maybe maybe the woman has grown up in an abusive household. And so this is her understanding and kind of framework of, well, this is what conflict resolution looks like in a relationship. And so the abuse is then normalized. So it's kind of, again, expected, and you're just meant to tolerate it. Or other things like, again, I mentioned shame before. Oftentimes an abusive partner will actually use this to blame the victim, to say, well, I don't want to hurt you, but actually this is your fault. If you didn't do 1, 2, 3, then I wouldn't act this way.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of this shame, there's this low self-esteem that's happening, or even just practically like lack of resources. So if a woman is financially dependent on an abusive partner, and maybe, and part of that is actually a form of economic abuse, where within this relationship, to maintain control, he's actually prohibited her or inhibited her from working, or if she does work, then he controls the finances. So she's not able to actually become financially independent in a way that would allow her to leave an abusive relationship. So I think it's easy to say, and that's not even getting into, maybe you have children together, maybe you're staying for the sake of the children, maybe you genuinely have romantic love for this person and you just want them to be the person that you fell in love with. I mean, we hear this often from our clients, like, I don't want to open a case, I don't want him to go to jail, I just want the abuse to stop. And so I think it's, it's all of these things mixed in with perhaps even other vulnerability factors. So things like, if you're undocumented or if you're a person with a disability, you're at increased risk of vulnerability. So it's easy to say, like, well, why doesn't she leave? Like, it's that simple. But obviously, when you have all of these things intertwined, it can be quite complex.
No, you're right, Lindsay. And so you mentioned, if in intimate partner violence, if there were to be kids involved. So how can we go about supporting minors who grew up in this type of environment?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because, the research does show that if you grow up in a home where you are exposed to this violence, this type of violence, then, as a girl, I mean, we'll just use kind of gender normatives, as a girl child, you're then more likely to be in an abusive relationship when you grow up. And as a boy child, you're more likely to be abusive in a relationship when you grow up. And again, it comes down to this, you're, as a kid, you're learning, how does the world work? What does love look like? What does conflict resolution look like within a relationship? And so if this is your example, again, you grow up in an environment where that abuse is normalized. And so, and we know, I mean, sadly, the research shows us that witnessing abuse has very negative impacts on children, on their ability to learn, their ability to do well in school. Kind of, it does negatively impact their outcomes as well. And so, in terms of kind of how to help, I think where, even if the mother isn't necessarily in a situation where she's able to leave for those reasons that I've mentioned, perhaps she's willing to get support for her children. So, there are organizations that do counseling. So, for example, with our clients, when we are supporting a mom who's experiencing intimate partner violence, we also then provide therapy and counseling for her children as well. So there are a number of organizations that would provide therapy or counseling for children who've witnessed abuse. So that could be one just practical thing. The other thing, and this really isn't nice to talk about or think about, but the other very practical thing would be around just safety planning and thinking about safety planning with the children. Because, like, helping the kids know what to do, like, when things get bad. And so that can, because I think even with young children as well, there are situations where the child will then be an indirect victim, where maybe the perpetrator wasn't intending to hurt them, but they, trying to intervene to protect mom, they themselves get hurt. So some of the work that we do is, even, okay, if you're not able to leave the relationship, then let's help your kids know, okay, when mom and dad start yelling, then you need to go next door to the neighbor, or you need to go in your room and close the door. Like those sorts of things. Again, just very unpleasant, but very practical.
I can imagine for a parent to actually have to sit their kid down and explain that
Mm,
to them or prepare them for instances like that. It's really unpleasant. And it's also a
yeah.
very sad reality that many families in South Africa have to go through that. So
Mm.
let's move things on to like a little bit of on the legal side. What
Mm.
are the legal remedies available in cases of GBV in South Africa?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two kind of main areas. So there's the criminal side and then the civil side. So on the criminal side, if you're experiencing intimate partner violence, and depending on the nature of that violence, then it could qualify for a criminal offense. And so what I mean by that is there's no criminal offense that's called domestic violence,
Yes.
but again, depending on the nature of the domestic violence, it would be an assault, or if it's a serious form of assault, it's called assault GBH,
Mhm.
or it could be other associated charges. So if in the course of the assault, the abusive partner damages property, then you could also connect your assault charge with like a malicious damage to property charge. Or
Mhm.
if you had a protection order in place and that assault was then in violation of that protection order, you would add on a contravention of a protection order charge, which just means a violation of a protection order. And so that would be, those are kind of different types of criminal charges that you could have connected to a domestic violence incident,
Mhm.
as well as then a range of sexual offenses. So depending on the nature, either rape or sexual assault, attempted rape, all sorts of, there's a variety of different types of criminal offenses.
Mhm.
So that's on the criminal side. And then if you're looking at then the civil side, then you can apply for a protection order.
Mhm.
So for a protection order, in order to qualify for protection order under the Domestic Violence Act, you then just need to have, there needs to be a form of domestic violence that has occurred, and you need to have a domestic relationship between the two parties.
Okay.
And basically in terms of what is a domestic relationship, it's either somebody you are in a relationship with, or you have been, it's somebody you're married to, or you have been, it's people who live in the same home, people who have then a close relationship. You don't have to cohabitate. You can just, boyfriend and girlfriend, or, or ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend, or within same-sex relationships, etc. So those are all of those would then qualify for a protection order under the Domestic Violence Act.
Okay. And then just to sort of clarify, that will include all forms of GBV. So whether it's emotional, financial, you name it.
Exactly. So the definition of domestic violence under the Domestic Violence Act is very broad,
Okay.
and it's actually just been broadened further with the recent amendments to the Domestic Violence Act.
Okay. Okay. Um, so the other day I put out a little intro to our live today, and I received a lot of questions with regards to our justice system, and people want to know what are the common misconceptions that one might have about their availability or their access to the justice system,
Yeah,
being a gender violence victim.
yeah. Um, I think that, if you're looking at, like, let's say protection orders, I think there is a lot of misunderstanding or misconception around that. Who qualifies, again, what's the process? I think it feels really intimidating. So I think that's one of the things that I would say is that the protection order application process is actually designed to be quite accessible and quite user friendly.
Mm-hmm.
So, often people will think, well, now I need an attorney and I can't afford an attorney.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really as simple as, going to the court, you're given a copy of the form. It's broken down in a way that anybody can understand, and there's clerks at the court, or sometimes there's a help desk
Mm-hmm.
if you need additional assistance in completing those forms. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the things, is that process in of itself isn't as kind of intimidating, maybe, as it's still intimidating, especially if you're not a legal person, but it's not,
It's very
you know,
intimidating for non.
but it's not, it's not as intimidating perhaps as
Yes.
one might think.
Yes.
Um, So I think that's the one thing. The other thing is that often people will think that, well, I'm not going to get a protection order because I don't want to or I'm not able to end this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually one of the things that you can have a protection order in place and still cohabitate with the person.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the other common misconceptions. I think people also try to use protection orders to get other things, if that makes sense. So, for example, they would want to use a protection order to try and evict someone, or they would use a protection order to try and get maintenance or to deal with a custody issue. And so I think there's some misunderstandings around what a protection order is and isn't used for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then similarly, just to speak briefly about the criminal side, I think that, again, people often will feel like they need their own attorney. They'll get confused when they'll say, wait, but he has an attorney and I don't have one.
Mm-hmm.
And just not understanding that in a criminal case, then, it's the prosecutor, the state prosecutor under the NPA that then represents your side of the case, so that in a criminal offense, you don't need your own attorney.
Mm. No, that helps, and I'm very glad that you mentioned that because many people are unaware of what they can do, what steps, immediate steps, if they want to take to get a protection order. And something that I do, I try to do it as often now as possible with Norton Rose, is to sit at the help desk at the Madge Court, where we do assist these victims that walk in to complete the forms and sort of help them get their protection order. So is that something that LVA, your organization, does? Or can you tell us, what does your organization completely do?
Yeah, so our mission at LVA is to ensure that victims of gender-based violence have meaningful access to justice. And we do that by providing, as I mentioned before, we do direct services to victims and survivors of violence. So with our legal services, we provide comprehensive support in criminal cases. So that's everything from, in the communities where we work, we accompany clients to the police station to make sure their cases are open, they're not turned away. We follow up with investigating officers to make sure cases don't fall through the cracks, that perpetrators are arrested, providing that support all the way through the process to for cases that go to trial, then providing support to the client through that trial process as well. And then on the civil side, we also then provide a comprehensive support with protection order application. So again, that's consulting with the client, assisting them in completing the forms, preparing them for, that initial submission, to serve the form on the perpetrator, as well as preparing them for their final hearing in court. So that's on the one side with the legal services. And then we use what we call an integrated model, where our legal services are then integrated with psychosocial support. So essentially what that means is we provide counseling, we provide therapy for our clients, both individual one-on-one basis as well as in small groups. And we also do workshops to help people understand better kind of impacts of trauma, what is trauma, impacts of trauma in their own lives, how to better care for themselves and others. And then we also just work in communities to raise awareness about GBV, to make sure people are educated and know about their legal rights and available remedies where they can go for help. And then lastly, we work to hold the justice system accountable. So through our legal support, we then, and by accompanying clients through the justice process, we then make sure that we are holding state actors accountable when they fail to fulfill their obligations under the law, as well as then providing them support to help them do their jobs effectively. So yeah, that's what we do in a nutshell. We operate in 3 communities here in Johannesburg. So we're in Diepsloot, in Orange Farm, and in Hillbrow.
Okay. No, it's amazing, Lindsay, what you're doing. I think GBV is a plague that affects everyone around the world, irrespective of your gender. And we need more people to get involved and to try and assist. And so if anyone is watching here now, and if they are a victim of GBV, or if they know someone who is a victim, how can they get in touch with you? Or do they just come and see you at the office, or how can they go about taking those steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the best way to get in touch with us, you can get in touch with us either through our social media pages. So you can follow us, contact us. Our handle is just Lawyers Against Abuse. So we're on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. Or you can go to our website, which is just lva.org.za. And on the website, we have a contact us form. You can just fill that in. Those come to me. And then we can either advise you, or we can even, if we're not able to assist, then put you in contact, perhaps with the service provider that's in your area as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, amazing. And then if someone wants to get hold of you to sort of also make a difference and to see how they can put their hands into your organization as well, will they go
Yeah.
about it the same way?
Yeah, I think the best way would just either be to use the contact form. Like I said, those will come directly to me, or to reach out via one of our social media pages. But yeah, I mean, we are, as a nonprofit organization, all of our services are completely free to the victims and survivors that we support. And so because of that, we are dependent on just the donations that we receive from individuals as well as from corporates, and other foundations and things like that. So yeah, no donation is too small. Every donation makes a difference and allows us to keep doing the work that we do. So if that's something that, if this work speaks to you and you want to get involved in, yeah, just in a more kind of meaningful way, then we'd love to engage.
Oh, amazing, Lindsay. So before we end, I just want to see if there are any comments, any questions. Um, my I think my comments have been switched off, so I haven't seen anything come through. But if anyone does have any question or any comment, or if you want to contact Lindsay directly, I am going to post this onto my grid, and then they can reach you via that directly.
Okay.
And just feel free to send us a DM if you don't want to comment publicly. There is help out there. There are many organizations and there are many people doing good, just like what Lindsay is doing. And gender-based
So
violence victims are not alone, like you said. If there isn't someone that you can trust to speak to, then reach out to Lawyers Against Abuse, and they will definitely, hold your hand throughout the process.
And there's just, yeah, if I could use this as an opportunity to just share maybe a few more resources. So there's an organization called Tears. They run just a hotline. It's a free USSD where if you use that, then it'll actually use your phone's geolocation, and it'll send you an SMS with contact details for like 3 or 4 of the closest organizations or resources in your area. So that's a really fantastic resource. So that's it's *134 *7355 hash, or you can just look up Tears Foundation and it's on their website as well. I already mentioned that Rape Crisis has a fantastic free 24/7 counseling hotline. As well as then, if you're in need of shelter, there's a national shelter movement. So they also run a free hotline. It's 0800 001 005. And that's a network of shelters around the country. And so they'll help connect you to a shelter nearest to you. And again, you can contact LVA for legal advice. That's something that outside of the communities where we work, we do advise people in terms of their legal rights, legal remedies, answer any questions that they have about the legal process if they're in it, or just want to know more before what their options are before they take steps further. So yeah, you're welcome to contact us for that, or again, to help, or we're happy to help connect you to other resources as well.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you for your time. And we will definitely keep in touch. And I hope that this helps at least one person out there.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.